Welcome back, everybody. As I mentioned earlier, this chapter ended up running long and got split out into two parts, so this is going to pick up where we left off from part 1. Once again, this is chapter 2, part 2 of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, written by Ilan Pappe, 2006, read 2024. We resume the conversation about Ezra Danin's contribution to the ethnic cleansing, the Orientalist or Arabist system of informants that were set up to gather intel on Arab villages, setting up the planning stages and infrastructure for the violence of the Nakba. Danin recruited a German Jew named Yaakov Shimoni later to become one of Israel's leading Orientalists and put him in charge of special projects inside the villages, in particular supervising the work of the informants. One of these, Danin and Shimoni nicknamed the quote-unquote treasurer, or ha-gizbar. This man, who proved a fountain of information for the files collectors, supervised the network of collaboration for them between 1941 and 1945. He was exposed in 1945 and killed by Palestinian militants. Danin and Shimoni were soon joined by two other people, Yeshua Palmon and Tuvia Lishansky. These two are names to remember as they took an active part in preparing for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Lishansky was already busy in the 1940s with orchestrating campaigns against the tenants who lived on plots of lands the JNF had bought from present or absentee landlords, and he directed all his energy towards intimidating and then forcibly evicting these people from the lands their families had been cultivating for centuries. Not far away from the village of Fureidis and the quote-unquote veteran Jewish settlement Zikron Yaakov, where today a road connects the coastal highway with Marj ibn Amir, Emek, Israel, through Wadi Milk, lies a youth village, a kind of boarding school for Zionist youth called Shefeya. It was here that in 1944 special units in the service of the Village Files Project received their training, and it was from here that they went out on their reconnaissance missions. Shefeya looked very much like a spy village in the Cold War. Jews walking around speaking Arabic and trying to emulate what they believed were the customary ways of life and behavior of rural Palestinians. In 2002, one of the first recruits to the special training base recalled his first reconnaissance mission to the nearby village of al-Zinat in 1944. Their aim had been to survey the village and bring back information such as where the Mukhtar lived, where the mosque was located, where the rich people of the village resided, and who had been active in the 1936 revolt. This was not a very dangerous mission, as the infiltrators knew they could exploit the traditional Arab hospitality code and were even guests at the home of the Mukhtar himself. As they failed to collect in one day all the data they were seeking, they asked to be invited back. For their second visit, they had been instructed to get information about the fertility of the land, the quality of which seemed to have impressed them greatly. In 1948, al-Zinat was destroyed and all its inhabitants expelled, without any provocation on their part whatsoever. The final update of the village files took place in 1947. It focused on creating lists of quote-unquote wanted persons in each village. In 1948, Jewish troops used these lists for the search and arrest operations they carried out as soon as they had occupied a village. That is, the men in the village would be lined up and those appearing on the lists would then be identified, often by the same person who had informed on them in the first place, but who would now be wearing a cloth sack over his head with 2 holes cut out for his eyes, so as not to be recognized. The men who were picked out were often shot on the spot. Criteria for inclusion in these lists were involvement in the Palestinian national movement, having close ties to the leader of the movement, the Mufti al-Hajj Amin al-Husayni, and as mentioned, having participated in actions against the British and the Zionists. Other reasons for being included in the lists were a variety of allegations such as, quote, known to have traveled to Lebanon, unquote, or, quote, arrested by the British authorities for being a member of a national committee in the village, unquote. The first category, involvement in the Palestinian national movement, was very liberally defined and could include whole villages. Affiliation with the Mufti or to the political party he headed was very common. After all, his party had dominated local Palestinian politics ever since the British Mandate was officially established in 1923. The party's members went on to win national and municipal elections and hold the prominent positions in the Arab Higher Committee that became the embryonic government of the Palestinians. In the eyes of the Zionist experts, this constituted a crime. If we look at the 1947 files, we find that villages with about 1,500 inhabitants usually had between 20 and 30 such suspects. For instance, around the southern Carmel Mountains, south of Haifa, al-Zinat had 30 such suspects, and the nearby village of Damun had 25. Yigael Yadin recalled that it was this minute and detailed knowledge of what was happening in each single Palestinian village that enabled the Zionist military command in November 1947 to conclude, quote, that the Palestine Arabs had nobody to organize them properly, unquote. The only serious problem was the British. Quote, if not for the British, we could have quelled the Arab riot, the opposition to the UN partition resolution in 1947, in 1 month, unquote. The next section is titled Facing the British, 1945 to 1947. Beyond carefully charting rural Palestine in preparation for the future takeover of the country, the Zionist movement had by now also obtained a much clearer sense of how best to get the new state off the ground after the Second World War. A crucial factor in this was that the British had already destroyed the Palestinian leadership and its defense capabilities when they suppressed the 1936 revolt, thus allowing the Zionist leadership ample time and space to set out their next moves. Once the danger of a Nazi invasion into Palestine was removed in 1942, the Zionist leaders became more keenly aware that the sole obstacle that stood in their way of successfully seizing the land was the British presence, not any Palestinian resistance. This explains why, for example, in a meeting in the Biltmore Hotel in New York in 1942, we find Ben-Gurion putting demands on the table for a Jewish commonwealth over the whole of mandatory Palestine. As the Second World War drew to a close, the Jewish leadership in Palestine embarked on a campaign to push the British out of the country. Simultaneously, they continued to map out their plans for the Palestinian population, the country's 75% majority. Leading Zionist figures did not air their views in public, but confided their thoughts only to their close associates or entered them into their diaries. One of them, Yosef Weitz, wrote in 1940, quote, "It is our right to transfer the Arabs," unquote, and, quote, "the Arabs should go," unquote. Ben-Gurion himself, writing to his son in 1937, appeared convinced that this was the only course of action open to Zionism. Quote, "The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war," unquote. The opportune moment came in 1948. Ben-Gurion is in many ways the founder of the State of Israel and was its first prime minister. He also masterminded the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. David Ben-Gurion, the architect. David Ben-Gurion led the Zionist movement from the mid-1920s until well into the 1960s. Born David Gruen in 1886 in Plonsk, Poland, then part of Tsarist Russia, he had come to Palestine in 1906, already an ardent Zionist. Short of stature, with a large shock of white hair swept backwards and invariably dressed in khaki uniform, his figure is by now familiar to many around the world. When the ethnic cleansing operations began, he added a pistol to his military gear and a kufiya around his neck, imitating the way his elite units were fitted out. He was by then approximately 60 years old, and although suffering from serious backaches, he was the Zionist movement's highly energetic and hard-working leader. His central role in deciding the fate of the Palestinians stemmed from the complete control he exercised over all issues of security and defense in the Jewish community in Palestine. He had risen to power as a union leader, but was soon busy engineering the Jewish state in the making. When the British offered the Jewish community a state in 1937, but over a much smaller portion of Palestine than they had in mind, Ben-Gurion accepted the proposal as a good start, but he aspired to Jewish sovereignty over as much of Palestine as possible. He then swayed the Zionist leadership into accepting both his supreme authority and the fundamental notion that future statehood meant absolute Jewish domination. How to achieve such a purely Jewish state was also discussed under his guidance around 1937. Two magic words now emerged: force and opportunity. The Jewish state could only be won by force, but one had to wait for the opportune historical moment to come along in order to be able to deal, quote-unquote, militarily with the demographic reality on the ground, the presence of a non-Jewish native majority population. Ben-Gurion's focus on long-term processes and comprehensive solutions was atypical of most of his colleagues in the Zionist leadership. They still hoped that by purchasing a piece of land here and a few houses there, they would be able to establish the envisaged new reality. Ben-Gurion understood early on that this would never be enough, and of course he was right. By the end of the mandate, as we have already seen, the Zionist movement had only been able to purchase around 6% of the land. But even the more cautious Zionist leaders, such as Ben-Gurion's second-in-command, Moshe Sharet, the foreign minister of the Jewish community in Mandatory Palestine, associated the settlement of Jews in Palestine with the dispossession of the indigenous Palestinians. For example, on the 13th of December 1938, when giving a lecture to the employees of the Zionist organizations in Jerusalem, Sharet could report to them on a particularly satisfying achievement: the purchase of 2,500 dunam in the Beisan Valley in eastern Palestine. 1 dunam equals 1,000 square meters, or 0.1 hectares. He added a telling detail, quote, "This purchase was accompanied, interestingly, by transfer of population." Unsure of his audience's familiarity with the term, he repeated it in English. "There is a tribe that resides west of the Jordan River, and the purchase will include paying the tribe to move east of the river. By this act, we will reduce the number of Arabs in Palestine." Unquote. In 1942, as we saw above, Ben-Gurion was already aiming much higher when he publicly staked out the Zionist claim for the whole of Palestine. As in the days of the Balfour Declaration, Zionist leaders understood the promise to include the country as a whole. But he was a pragmatic colonialist as well as a state builder. He knew that maximalist schemes such as the Biltmore Program, which clamored for the whole of Mandatory Palestine, would not be deemed realistic. It was also, of course, impossible to pressure Britain while it was holding the fort against Nazi Germany in Europe. Consequently, he lowered his ambitions during the Second World War, but the post-war British Labour government under Clement Attlee had different plans for Palestine. Now that Jews in Europe were no longer facing the danger of annihilation, and most of them preferred to leave for the other side of the Atlantic rather than head toward the Middle East, the new British cabinet and its energetic Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, were looking for a solution that would be based on the wishes and interests of the people actually living in Palestine, and not of those the Zionist leaders claimed might want to move there. In other words, a democratic solution. Armed but especially terrorist attacks by the Jewish underground militias failed to change that policy. Against the bombing of bridges, military bases, and the British headquarters in Jerusalem, the King David Hotel, the British reacted mildly, especially in comparison with the brutal treatment they had meted out to Palestinian rebels in the 1930s. Retaliation took the form of a disarmament campaign of Jewish troops, a large number of whom they themselves had armed and recruited, first in the war against the Palestinian Rebellion in 1937, and then against the Axis powers in 1939. Disarmament was very partial, but arrests were relatively numerous, enough for the Zionist leaders to realize they needed to pursue a more adaptive policy as long as the British were still responsible for law and order in the land. As we have already seen, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Britain held a disproportionately large number of troops, 100,000, in a country of less than 2 million people. This definitely served as a deterrent, even when in the wake of the Jewish terrorist attack on the King David Hotel, this force was somewhat reduced. It was these considerations that prompted Ben-Gurion to conclude that a somewhat more, quote-unquote, reduced state, over 80% of Palestine, would be sufficient to allow the Zionist movement to fulfill its dreams and ambitions. In the final days of August 1946, Ben-Gurion gathered together the leadership of the Zionist movement in a hotel in Paris, the Royal Monsieur, to help him find an alternative to the Biltmore plan that had aimed to take over all of Palestine. An quote-unquote old-new idea of the Zionist movement now resurfaced: partitioning Palestine. Quote, "Give us independence even on a small part of the land," unquote, pleaded Nashum Goldman with the British government in London, while his colleagues in Paris were deliberating their next move. Goldman was the most quote-unquote dovish member of the Zionist leadership at the time, and his call for only a small part of Palestine did not reflect Ben-Gurion's ambitions. He accepted the principle, but not the dimensions. Quote, "We will demand a large chunk of Palestine," unquote, Ben-Gurion told those he had summoned to the French capital. Like generations of Israeli leaders after him up to Ariel Sharon in 2005, Ben-Gurion found he had to hold back the more extremist Zionist members, and he told them that 80 to 90% of mandatory Palestine was enough to create a viable state, provided they were able to ensure Jewish predominance. Neither the concept nor the percentage would change over the next 60 years. A few months later, the Jewish Agency translated Ben-Gurion's, quote, "large chunk of Palestine," unquote, into a map, which it distributed to everyone relevant to the future of Palestine. This 1947 map envisaged a Jewish state that anticipated almost the last dot pre-1967 Israel, i.e. Palestine, without the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. During all these deliberations, the Zionist leaders never discussed the possibility of any resistance from the local population. Their chief concern was the British and maybe the international response. This is not accidental. The Zionist leadership was aware of the total collapse of the Palestinian leadership after the Second World War, and of the hesitant position the Arab states as a whole were displaying on the Palestine question. The desperate situation of the indigenous population of Palestine becomes poignantly clear the moment we realize that those who had crushed their liberation movement, the British mandatory authorities, were now the only ones standing between them and a coolly determined and highly motivated Zionist movement that coveted most of their homeland. But worse was to come as Europe prepared to compensate the Jewish people for the Holocaust that had raged on its soil with a state in Palestine, ignoring at the same time that this could only come about at the expense of the indigenous Palestinians. Given the power vacuum on the Palestinian side, it is not surprising to see the Zionist decision-makers act as though the Palestinians were not a factor to be considered. But of course, they still formed the vast majority in the land, and as such, they were a quote-unquote problem. Moreover, the Arab world, potentially at least, could come to their rescue and send in armies and provide arms. David Ben-Gurion was fully aware of this possible scenario and therefore preoccupied himself and his closest associates with the issue of security, bitachon in Hebrew. This became an obsession Ben-Gurion nourished so carefully and successfully that it came to overshadow all other social and political issues on the agenda of the Jewish community in Palestine and later, of course, in Israel. Bitachon was then and remains until today a meta-term used by Zionist and later Israeli leaders to cover a wide range of issues and justify numerous core policies, from arms purchases abroad, internal struggle with other political parties, preparations for the future state, and the policy adopted against the local Palestinian population. The latter was retaliatory in nature and in discourse, but quite often provocative in action. From 1946 onwards, a more comprehensive set of strategic objectives emerged, aimed at consolidating the future scenarios and plans. David Ben-Gurion played a crucial role in shaping Israel's bitachon outlook because of the structural changes he introduced into the Zionist decision-making mechanism that placed him at the top of what before had been a rather cumbersome and ineffective pyramid. When in 1946 the 22nd Zionist Congress entrusted Ben-Gurion with the defense portfolio, he had total control over all security issues of the Jewish community in Palestine. Though as yet without a state, Ben-Gurion already now functioned as defense minister and as a prime minister of sorts, given his authority to pass resolutions within a government. In many aspects, he shared responsibility, and most issues on the agenda of the Jewish community were discussed in a democratic way within institutions that represented the composition of the major political groups among the Jews in Palestine. But as the time came nearer when crucial decisions needed to be made with regards to the fate of the Palestinians, Ben-Gurion began to ignore the official structure and started relying on more clandestine formations. The major topic on the Zionist agenda in 1946 and 1947, the struggle against the British, resolved itself with the British decision in February 1947 to quit Palestine and to transfer the Palestine question to the UN. In fact, the British had little choice. After the Holocaust, they would never be able to deal with the looming Jewish rebellion as they had with the Arab one in the 1930s. And as the Labour Party made up its mind to leave India, Palestine lost much of its attraction. A particularly cold winter in 1947 drove the message home to London that the empire was on its way to become a second-rate power, its global influence dwarfed by the two new superpowers and its economy crippled by a capitalist system that caused sterling to drop precipitously. Rather than hold on to the remote places such as Palestine, the Labour Party saw as its priority the building of a welfare state at home. In the end, Britain left in a hurry and with no regrets. Ben-Gurion had already realized by the end of 1946 that the British were on their way out, and with his aides began working on a general strategy that could be implemented against the Palestinian population the moment the British were gone. This strategy became Plan C, or Gimel in Hebrew. Plan C was a revised version of two earlier plans, A and B. Plan A was also named the Elimelech Plan after Elimelech Avner, the Haganah commander in Tel Aviv, who in 1937, at Ben-Gurion's request, had already set out possible guidelines for the takeover of Palestine in the event of a British withdrawal. Plan B had been devised in 1946, and both plans were now fused into one to form Plan C. Like Plans A and B, Plan C aimed to prepare the military forces of the Jewish community in Palestine for the offensive campaigns they would be engaged in against rural and urban Palestine the moment the British were gone. The purpose of such actions would be to, quote-unquote, deter the Palestinian population from attacking Jewish settlements and to retaliate for assaults on Jewish houses, roads, and traffic. Plan C spelled out clearly what punitive actions of this kind would entail. Quote, killing the Palestinian political leadership, killing Palestinian insiders and their financial supporters, killing Palestinians who acted against Jews, killing senior Palestinian officers and officials in the mandatory system, damaging Palestinian transportation, damaging the sources of Palestinian livelihoods, i.e. water wells, mills, etc., attacking nearby Palestinian villages likely to assist in future attacks, and attacking Palestinian clubs, coffee houses, meeting places, etc. Unquote. Plan C added that all data required for the performance of these actions could be found in the village files, lists of leaders, activists, quote, potential human targets, unquote, the precise layout of villages, and so on. However, within a few months, yet another plan was drawn up, Plan D, Dalet. It was this plan that sealed the fate of the Palestinians within the territory the Zionist leaders had set their eyes on for their future Jewish state. Indifferent as to whether these Palestinians might decide to collaborate with or oppose their Jewish state, Plan Dalet called for their systematic and total expulsion from their homeland. This is part 2 of chapter 2 of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, written by Ilan Pappe in 2007, read in 2024. Thanks for reading along with me, and stay tuned for chapter 3.